In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about Flask, and then we're going to create a small Flask application to get a feel for how it works. So what is Flask? Flask is something called a micro-framework. A micro-framework is a web application framework that only includes the minimum amount of features required to facilitate development. It's not overly opinionated, and it works great with other technologies. So when should you use Flask? Flask can really be used with any type of web application, but it works best with smaller applications, prototyping, and for developers who don't want to commit to a full-fledged framework. Some disadvantages of Flask are that it comes with no functionality outside of the framework basics. For example, if you were working in something like Django, that comes with a built-in user management system, which can be really handy if you're going to need user management anyway. Flask itself is less mature than some other frameworks, which typically means it's not as battle-hardened, and sometimes means that there's a smaller community of developers that are associated with it, which can also mean less support and fewer extensions for the framework. So now that we've talked a little bit about what Flask is, let's make a very basic Flask application to get a feel for how it works. So the first step is to create our project directory. So first I'm going to cd into our source directory, our shared directory, and then we're going to create a folder called Reminders, and then we're going to cd into that. And now we're going to activate our virtual environment. So we're going to go .env reminders bin activate, and there you go. You can see the prompt is indicating that our virtual environment is active. So the next step is to install Flask. For that we're going to use pip. So we'll go pip install Flask, just like before. And you can see that it's already installed from our previous command. And then the next step is we're going to create our application file. Now this is a very, very basic Flask app like I had mentioned, so it's really only going to be one file. So what we'll do is we'll switch over to our code editor. And then we're going to create a new file. There we go. And we'll call it app.py. So this is where we're going to house our application logic. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is import our Flask class from our Flask module. So we'll go from Flask, import the Flask class. We're going to use this class to instantiate an object, or an application object rather. So we'll go down 2 lines, and then we're going to define our application. So we'll go app equal to Flask, and then we want to give it one parameter, which is the special variable for the Python file name. So this creates our application object. So alone, the application object doesn't really do anything. But what we need to do next is add a view to the application object, which will allow us to give the application some type of logic. So we're going to go down 2 lines. We're going to go at app.root. And then inside this, we're going to give one parameter, which is just going to be the slash. So this is a Python decorator. If you're not familiar with Python decorators, definitely pause right now and do a quick read up. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but what we're going to do with this is decorate a function. So what I'll do is I'll create the function and then we'll discuss what it's doing exactly. So down 1 line, we'll go define hello with no parameters, and then we'll go return hello world. Okay, so what we've done here, this is called a view, and we've registered this view to the application object using what's called a root. So a root basically tells your application what to do with its traffic. So what we're saying here is for all traffic at the base domain, fire this function and do this functionality. And what I mean by the base domain is, like, let's say our domain is google.com. If somebody puts in google.com into their browser with nothing after it, that's what's considered the base domain. Some people will call that index, server root, but basically it means your domain without any extensions after it. And then inside this application, we're returning some string or some text which says hello world. So let's just test it, and then that'll give us a better idea of what it does. So what we'll do next is we'll switch over to our shell, and we're going to start our Flask application now. So first we're going to define the environment variable Flask app, or rather Flask underscore app, and make that equal to app.py, which is our application file name. And then we're going to use the command flask run. Now, because I'm working on a virtual environment, and most likely you are too, we want to expose this application outside of the virtual environment, or sorry, rather the virtual machine. So we want to go host 0.0.0.0, which will expose it externally. So we'll hit enter, and there you can see the application is running, serving Flask app, and running on 0.0.0.0 port 5000. So next we're going to, I'll pull up another tab, and what we're going to do is check what our virtual machine IP address is, or our local area network IP address is. So we'll go ifconfig. So you can see mine is 192.168.2.25. So now we switch over to our browser, and then in our browser we type that address, so 192.168.2.25, but we want to put port 5000 because that's the port that Flask has bound to. So then we hit enter, and you can see hello world, which is the text that we're returning from our view. So now if we switch over to our shell, you can see an entry there, which was our HTTP request to the server. And then if we switch over to our code, we'll do a quick example of how you can define different routes. So we'll change the route to hello instead of just the base. And we'll save that, and then we'll switch back over to our shell. And because I didn't add the debug flag, we're going to have to stop and restart our server. So there you go, it's waiting again. And we'll switch over to Chrome. So now we want to go /hello. And you can see the view has been changed to the hello extension of our domain. So that's it. We have a working Flask application. It's very basic. It doesn't really do anything, but it's a good idea to do this simply because it illustrates how easy it is to hit the ground running with Flask, and how easy it is to just kind of get your application up and running, especially if it's a small application and you don't need a lot of structure, or if you're just doing some type of prototyping or something like that. So that's it for this lesson. Our next lesson we'll be creating our application structure, which will include creating a Flask app using the factory pattern.